In 1981, Sonia Carmen Herok Stone was murdered in the home she shared with her 4-year-old daughter in Carmel, California. In August of 2021, after testing DNA at the scene, investigators made an arrest in the 40-year-old crime. Unlike other cold cases we've looked at, in this crime, investigators had a suspect early on in 1981, one they arrested several times, and even went to trial to try to convict. As it turns out, it's the same suspect investigators have arrested, once again, just 2 months ago. In this episode of California True Crime, I cover the murder of Sonia Herok Stone, and in particular, the efforts by investigators to hold someone accountable. Welcome to this episode of California True Crime. I'm your host, Jessica, and I'll be giving you the details of this terrible murder. Like other cold cases we've covered, the details about the actual crime and victim are limited because this has been an open case for 40 years. This crime came to my attention in August of 2021 because an arrest was made in the case and it just came up in my news feed. But when I researched this case, it became clear that this one was different than the others we had looked into. The biggest difference is that in 1981, not long after the murder occurred, the sheriffs had a suspect in the case. They arrested the suspect 3 separate times and even went to trial, but were unable to hold him responsible for the crime. There were several reasons why investigators and the courts were unable to get a guilty verdict in this case, and they included an investigation that was referred to by one judge as, quote, illegal, as well as questions about witness and investigator accuracy. Luckily, that case ended in a mistrial, giving the state another chance to hold the alleged murderer responsible. And in the coming case, they have one big thing they didn't the first time: a DNA match. Since another trial is on the horizon, and investigators continue to allege that Glazebrook murdered Sonia Herok Stone, I'll take you through what happened the first time. This episode will mainly be detailing various hearings and preliminary trials, as well as the trial that happened, to give you an idea of what seems to have gone wrong the first time, and how the possibility of better evidence could really change everything. To give you this information, I used articles in The Californian. That's a Monterey-based newspaper, and you can find all of our sources for this and other episodes on CaliforniaTrueCrime.com. One other site has written about this case and a lot of other unsolved cases, many of which haven't received as much coverage or focus as they all should, and you should definitely check that site out. It's called Defrosting Cold Cases at defrostingcoldcases.com. You can also follow the author of that site, Alice DeSterler, at Your Crime Writer on Twitter. Before we get started, I also want to say that it's important to remember that a conviction has not been secured in this crime, and all people are innocent until proven guilty. The other quick thing is that the victim of this crime is referred to in many ways. Her full name is Sonia Carmen Herok Stone, and there are variations of using just Stone or even Herok as her last name. We will use Herok Stone as her last name since that's how it appears most often in the newspapers. On October 15th, 1981, Sonia Carmen Herok Stone was 30 years old and living in Carmel, California, at 26363 Rio Avenue. She lived there with her 4-year-old daughter, and she worked as a representative for the Levi Strauss & Company. October 15th was a Thursday. On that morning, Herok Stone's daughter was at school, and according to the Californian, it was believed that Herok Stone visited with a family member before returning home and arriving there sometime after 10 a.m. According to the Farmer's Almanac, October 15th was a cold winter day with a mean temperature of 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Carmel is a city by the ocean whose actual name is Carmel-by-the-Sea, and it's in Monterey County. It's also part of a specific location in Monterey County, often referred to as the Monterey Peninsula. Monterey is an interesting county. It has a lot of cities directly along the coast. These are kind of the cities you might hear about the most. But it also extends east into California, and many of those areas are considered agricultural towns. Herok Stone lived in Carmel-by-the-Sea. It's a really beautiful location where she lived, surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. Like a lot of especially Northern California beach towns, it has really wonderful moderate weather, and often, as I imagine it was on this October morning, it would be really overcast. Herok Stone's home is only 0.2 miles from Mara Beach in Carmel, and it would have been about a 4-minute walk. It's, like I said, it's a really beautiful area in Carmel. Carmel is actually a smaller town and actually reached its highest population in 1980 with about 4,700 people living there at the time. So this is a small community, and it's often described as an artist's enclave. On that Thursday, Herok Stone's friend stopped by the home at approximately 12 p.m., and she found her friend murdered inside. Her body was, quote, sprawled on the living room floor inside her home. At trial, her body is described as having some clothes removed, and her shirt and jacket were pulled back, sort of behind her back. She also had a pair of pantyhose wrapped around her neck. Her purse was on the floor, and its contents were spilled out near the body. The motive was believed to be sexual assault, but this will be questioned. And it's important to remember that, as we've talked about before, sexual assault evidence isn't always clear-cut. Investigators at the time appear to disagree on whether she was actually sexually assaulted, but they do believe that either way, this is the main motive for this crime. And this is not the first time we've seen this in a case, especially one where it's not as clear-cut what the motive was. In the case we talked about earlier this year of Denise Lampy just being murdered in Daly City, it appeared that that was the motive for the crime, but she fought back and the attacker wasn't able to carry out his motive. So sometimes it's very difficult to know exactly what happened. Investigators also consider robbery, but both of these motives have issues in court. On top of the way the body was found, there was evidence that a struggle had occurred inside the home. Blood, that was not the victim's, was found under Herok Stone's fingernails. And while I don't know what on the victim or at the crime scene was tested for DNA to make this 2021 arrest, capturing blood of her attacker would be a very important piece of evidence using modern technology. This was a case investigated by Monterey County Sheriff's detectives, and that is who has continued to investigate it even now. Investigators sent Herok Stone to San Francisco to the coroner's office for the autopsy and testing. The official cause of death came a week after her murder, and it was strangulation. There aren't a lot of details about the investigation into the murder in the newspaper. Most of the details come from articles after there is an arrest and in the coverage of various hearings and the trial. It appears that the day after the murder, investigators began interviewing the people in Herok Stone's life, as well as her neighbors. At some point during these interviews, investigators would come to suspect a neighbor of Herok Stone of her murder. This man was named Michael Glazebrook, and he lived just across the street from the victim. At trial, investigators say that what initially led them to suspect Glazebrook was that he seemed nervous when he talked with them, and he had a large scratch on his face. On top of which, according to investigators, they were able to get information from a couple of important witnesses in this case, and evidence from Glazebrook himself that I've never seen because that evidence actually wasn't allowed in a courtroom. As I go through the various hearings leading up to the trial, it's important to note that despite having some evidence that they allege made Glazebrook a suspect, there are also a lot of issues with both the investigation and witnesses. These seem to range from a possible perjury to an investigation where many mistakes were made. On December 18, 1981, 2 months after Herok Stone was found murdered, the Monterey County Sheriffs arrest Michael Glazebrook, who was 25 years old at the time, and had only been living in the Rio Avenue home for a short time. According to information given later at trial, Glazebrook was newly married and still in the process of moving his things into the home. He is held after his arrest in the Monterey County Jail with no bail. According to the newspaper, he was charged with the slaying of Herok Stone, but just a few days later, Glazebrook was let go, and the newspaper says that, quote, charges will not be filed against him. The assistant district attorney at the time, a man named Dean Flippo, tells the press that the reason Glazebrook isn't held and charges pursued is that there was insufficient evidence in the case. No other information appears in the newspaper until 7 months later in July of 1982. The police once again arrest Michael Glazebrook, and it will come out that investigators on the case had disagreed with the assessment of the assistant district attorney. That assessment was that there wasn't enough evidence in December of 1981 to hold Glazebrook and go to trial. So investigators waited until there was a shakeup in the DA's office, and a new deputy district attorney took the job. They went to this new deputy DA, presented their case, and he approved of the arrest in July. A felony arrest warrant was issued for Michael Glazebrook at his new home in Pacific Grove. Pacific Grove is still in the Monterey Peninsula, and it's about 5 to 7 miles north of Carmel-by-the-Sea. Pacific Grove police arrested Glazebrook on July 23, 1982, and bail was set at $250,000. Michael Glazebrook couldn't afford an attorney, so a public defender was assigned to him. In a hearing in August of 1982, the defense argued that Glazebrook should have a reduction in his bail. After all, according to them, he was not a flight risk. He had been the main suspect in this crime since at least December of 1981, and despite knowing that, he hadn't even left Monterey County. It was also argued that he wasn't a risk to the community. The judge agreed, and his bail was lowered from $250,000 to $50,000. The preliminary hearing started in November of 1982. This would be 4 months after Glazebrook was arrested the second time, and a year since Herok Stone was murdered. When putting together their case, investigators have to do a handful of important things. They need to describe what happened to Herok Stone, when it happened to her, and how they came to allege that Glazebrook was the one who had committed this horrible crime. It's important to note that preliminary hearings have a different standard of evidence than at a trial. At a preliminary hearing, the standard of proof is less than that needed to find someone guilty. The standard at this hearing is probable cause, or reasonable grounds for believing the defendant committed the crime. In the trial, the standard is evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Basically, that there isn't any other reasonable explanation depicted by the evidence presented that points in another direction or to another person. So the prosecution has to present evidence that probable cause exists that Glazebrook committed this crime, and give the judge reason enough to continue holding Glazebrook in jail and continue to trial. During this hearing, a serologist named Dr. Edward Blake took the stand and testified that he examined blood, semen, and urine from the victim and didn't find any evidence of sexual assault. Another expert, a Dr. Boyd Stevens, who is a coroner and chief medical examiner, testified. The court is told that he is an expert in reconstructing sexual assault scenes, and he testified that the bruising he saw on the victim was consistent with and evidence of sexual assault. A woman is also called to testify, and this is someone who is a friend of the alleged murderer. This is the first hint that there will be unexpected issues in this case, and it's difficult to know if this is an issue with the investigation itself or one of a witness perjuring themselves. According to investigators, this woman, named Michelle Wilson, had told them about a conversation she had had with Glazebrook. During this conversation, she said that Glazebrook had told her he was inside the victim's home the day of the murder. She also told investigators that she saw a scratch on Glazebrook's face, and that he said he received that scratch during an argument at Monterey Peninsula College the day after the murder. This is important for 2 reasons we discussed. It's important to put Glazebrook in Herok Stone's home on the day of the murder, and to pin down not just how, but when Glazebrook received the scratch on his face. The other issue this testimony speaks to is that investigators say Glazebrook's story about how he got that scratch changes several times. So having a witness speak to all of these things is crucial. However, when Michelle Wilson gets on the stand, she changes her story completely. And this seems to be a surprise to the prosecution, who asked the judge in chambers to remind her that she is under oath. Wilson says that, quote, the passage of time made her uncertain of the details of the conversation she had had with detectives, and denies ever telling them about a conversation with Glazebrook. In effect, she recanted, a word the newspaper used. To counter this, prosecutors put one of the sheriff detectives, who appears to have been responsible for much of the investigation, on the stand to share the information Wilson had given him and to combat her testimony that nothing had happened. When I first read this information in the newspaper, I assumed Wilson had changed her testimony. I don't know why she would do this. As we know, people have varying reasons, from fear to loyalty, for never coming forward with information that they might have in crimes. I don't know if that's the case here, but once I researched more, especially during the trial, there are more and more people who say that their testimony doesn't match the investigators' records. Most of that testimony is not as important as this one, but it makes it difficult to know just what happened in this particular instance. Despite this setback for the prosecution, once the preliminary hearing is ended, the judge decides that there was enough probable cause to bring charges against Glazebrook and proceed to trial. Since I don't have the trial transcripts, I don't have access to all of the evidence shared during that hearing, and I don't know exactly what evidence pointed specifically in Glazebrook's direction. What I do know is that in 2 follow-up hearings, 2 things happened. The first is that in a hearing in February 1983 in Monterey County Superior Court, a request is heard by a judge to dismiss all the charges based on a lack of evidence. The judge in this hearing uses the preliminary hearing transcript to make his decision. He decides, much like the original judge, that there is enough probable evidence to hold Glazebrook and go to trial. However, this judge warns that based on what he sees, he doesn't think there is enough evidence to convict someone beyond a reasonable doubt. The second thing that happens is a huge blow to the prosecution. In another hearing in June of 1983, the judge approved a motion by the defense to discard statements made by Glazebrook to police. These statements were described as, quote, incriminating, and I imagine if they were used during the preliminary hearing, they may have been one of the reasons probable cause was found. However, these statements are never able to be used in a courtroom, so I don't exactly know what they included, but after they are excluded, charges are dismissed against Glazebrook. This doesn't last long because Glazebrook is again arrested for murder in July of 1983. And this has to be, just when I think about it, a huge emotional wave for the family and loved ones of the victim to go through. This is almost 2 years after Herok Stone was found murdered, and after all is said and done, there will have been so many hearings in this case and appeals to those hearings that almost every judge in Monterey County will have eventually been a part of this case. So that has to be a lot for a family to go through, and all the while grieving a loved one. This new arrest means a new preliminary hearing and a new public defender for Glazebrook. This new hearing took just 3 days, and again it was decided that there was enough evidence, probable cause, to move to trial. I don't see anything that suggests this new arrest came because of new information or new evidence, so essentially all the same issues will still exist for prosecutors. And one of those issues is the statements made by Glazebrook to police, the ones that had been thrown out just before trial started the first time. It turns out these statements were acquired by investigators in an investigation that the judge in this case called, quote, surreptitious and illegal, meaning they were gotten through secretive means that were not done legally. It turns out when investigators are first looking into Herok Stone's murder, they come to suspect Glazebrook. Again, he was her neighbor at the time, living just across the street. In order to gather more evidence, investigators arrested Glazebrook on existing traffic warrants, and not for the murder itself. I don't know when this particular arrest occurred, but assuming the arrest we talked about, the very first arrest of Glazebrook, which was in December of 1981, was not this arrest. In the newspaper, it specifically says it was an arrest for the slaying, so we can kind of assume that this arrest perhaps happened before that. The judge says that this arrest was not on the up and up, but was a guise to look more into Glazebrook, ask him questions, etc., without having to place him under arrest for the murder and read him his Miranda rights. One of the ways this is suspect is that the investigators who arrested him for traffic warrants were actually homicide investigators and not traffic officers. During this arrest, Glazebrook allegedly made statements regarding the murder. These statements, as I said, are described as incriminating to officers. He also made them to an FBI agent and officers involved in his transport. Other evidence was also collected at that time, including blood and his clothes. The judge also says that they kept him in custody while, quote, interfering with his ability to post $165 bail, and that they didn't let his wife know he was in custody or inform him of the right that he had to make a call. As a result, the judge rules that any information or evidence gotten during that arrest, which he describes again as, quote, primarily for illegal purposes, was inadmissible in court. This has to be a huge blow for the prosecution, but the trial begins in November of 1983, and on that first day, there are even more issues. The prosecution puts on the stand several neighbors of Herok Stone and Glazebrook in an attempt to put Glazebrook in the area during the time of the murder. The main time period we're looking at is the time that Herok Stone got home after visiting a family member that Thursday, and noon, when her friend found her murdered. The prosecution puts this time between 10:15 a.m. and 12 p.m., and the defense tries to make an argument that Herok Stone may have gotten home closer to 11 a.m. This is important because neighbors, family, and friends, they testify to varying things about Glazebrook's whereabouts that morning. So they want to be able to place him, not in the area at the time of the murder. Several neighbors testify, and they all seem to disagree on whether or not Glazebrook was even at home that day. Some didn't think he was there at all. Some thought they possibly saw him leave mid-morning. Of particular interest is that the neighbors' testimony also seems to be a bit of surprise to the prosecution. The neighbors kind of disagree on why this is the case, but it seems that investigators have different information from things the neighbors had told them initially to what they're testifying to in court. Glazebrook's father also takes the stand. Glazebrook's parents lived in Seaside at the time. This is a city about 10 miles away from Carmel, and according to Google Maps, it would take about 16 minutes to get there by car. On the day of the murder, Glazebrook's father came home early from work to have lunch at about 11 a.m. He says that he saw his son at the house. Glazebrook was there to move more of his stuff to his new home in Carmel, and both of Glazebrook's parents also testified that they didn't see a scratch on their son's face that Thursday, and that would be during a time period that would have been after the murder took place. The prosecution again calls Michelle Wilson back to the stand, this time as a hostile witness. Nothing has changed in her testimony from that which she gave in the preliminary hearing, where she denied ever making statements to the police about a supposed conversation she had with Glazebrook. An emergency room doctor also testified he had treated Michael Glazebrook's face, the scratch on his face, that happened the day after the murder. The doctor testified that he didn't think the scratch was consistent with human fingernails, but of course, there are often differences between forensic testimony and that of a doctor. Investigators also testify. They say that Glazebrook told them that he received the scratch from a piece of plexiglass. This scratched him while he was in the backyard working on a boat. A bar owner in the area also testifies. She says that on that Thursday, when the murder had taken place, she saw a man who matched Glazebrook's appearance in her bar that night. This man also had a scratch on his face. Unfortunately, it was a year after the murder when investigators finally contacted her, and by that time, she didn't feel comfortable pinpointing or picking out a specific person who might have been in the bar, but she still remembered, the basic description. The reason I share this information with you is because it points to one of the big obstacles for prosecutors in this trial, and that is that the investigation appeared perhaps to not have been done as well as it could have been. Many of the witnesses testify to things that are completely different than what investigators say they learned from them, when they interviewed them the first time. And it becomes kind of unclear why this is. According to investigators, they kept written records of their interviews, and then after a time, they typed up those records and destroyed what they had written. The defense wants to be able to see the original records because they feel there might have been something lost in translation when they were typed up. However, since they were destroyed, that's just not possible. The judge decides that they weren't destroyed with, quote, malicious intent, so it's not really a problem. However, these discrepancies still remain. Glazebrook's parents, for instance, say when they were interviewed, no one kept any notes. The investigators disagree, but in the Californian, this description of how they kept notes was given. They said that, quote, they committed the reports to paper several days after the interviews. This quote is a little difficult to parse, but it does make it seem like interviews happened, and then a few days later, investigators wrote down the notes from memory, and then eventually typed up those notes. As we weren't part of that investigation, it's impossible to know what happened, but there does seem to be clear gaps between what witnesses say and what investigators have in their notes. And some of that can obviously be attributed to memory, especially when it comes to just seeing someone home or not home on the day in question. And then there are other, more important testimony where people seem to be recanting. Two big examples of this are, first, when one of the investigators is on the stand, he is asked how he came to suspect Glazebrook in this crime. The investigator replied that it was the scratch on Glazebrook's face and how nervous he was while being interviewed. The problem? Neither of those two things appeared in the investigator's notes. The second example happened when on the stand, one of the investigators says that the bar owner who had testified couldn't, as she said, positively identify Glazebrook. And this investigator backed that up, that that's what she said. But in his typed notes, the investigator had written that she could positively identify Glazebrook. So obviously those are two very big gaps in what people are testifying to, even investigators, and what is written in the notes. With the inability to bring evidence gotten during the illegal arrest, and then so many questions about the investigation itself, this case was not a slam dunk. The trial ended, and a jury of 8 men and 4 women got the case. On December 1983, the jury ended in a deadlock of 9-3 in favor of acquittal. This results in a mistrial. Whoever these 3 holdouts were, they are now very important to a future trial. Had Glazebrook been found not guilty, investigators would not be able to rearrest him, no matter how good the evidence allegedly is in this crime in 2021. After the decision, Glazebrook said he was relieved. Quote, "I felt from the very beginning that I was wrongly accused." The prosecutor still felt he was guilty, with the defense attorney calling it, quote, "sour grapes. He's a whiner. This case is history." It's definitely an interesting choice of words, because while Glazebrook went free, this case remained unsolved and unforgotten by the Monterey County sheriffs. In 2020, Monterey County Sheriff detectives decided to take a second look at the case. One of the big reasons behind this was that in 2020, the Monterey County District Attorney's Office put together a team of investigators to create a cold case task force. And we've seen in other episodes how important these types of task forces, or even the creation of cold case departments, or just hiring someone to look into cold case cases can be. Jane Doe number 40, for instance, once they hired a couple of cold case detectives, even for a limited number of hours, it made a huge difference in a bunch of cases in Long Beach, California. So this continues to be a very, I think, specific thing we as voters and members of communities can push for. More money put to this specific use. It seems to do a lot of good when it happens in these counties. Monterey County in general has over 500 unsolved cases. And those are all kinds of unsolved cases, murders, people going missing. So this is a really huge deal. As we all know, DNA is being tested in a lot of cases around the country and is helping solve more and more cases. In this case, when detectives went through evidence collected, they found the ability to test DNA from several pieces of evidence. They sent it to the California Department of Justice, who were able to develop a profile. Then they got a warrant for Glazebrook's DNA, and when it came back, that DNA matched DNA found at the scene. Glazebrook is now 65 years old, and in August of this year, Monterey County sheriffs arrested Glazebrook. In honor of the victim, they wore Levi's during the arrest, as she had worked, as I said, as a representative for the Levi's company. Glazebrook has been charged with first-degree murder with a special allegation of use of a deadly weapon in the commission of a crime. He has pleaded not guilty, and a $1 million bail was set. It's been 40 years since Sonia Carmen Herok Stone was murdered, since she was taken away from her daughter, who is now 44 years old, and all of her loved ones. Nothing can bring her back, or change the pain of those years, of the weight, or the thought that no one would ever be held responsible for this crime. But DNA, and hopefully a good investigation, may finally provide some of those answers. Like a lot of cases we've talked about this season, whether it meant new technology or new witnesses, they are the key. And in this case, Monterey County Sheriff's detectives need any information you have about this murder. If you have information about this crime, please contact Detective Eris Wilson at 831-755-7203 or Detective Sergeant Brian Hoskins at 831-755-3773.
For tonight's cold case, we'll be in Monterey. On August 18th, 1984, 58-year-old Francis Dialves was found in his apartment murdered. He lived in an apartment at 843 Hawthorne Street in Monterey, California. He had been stabbed many times, and his apartment was ransacked. Investigators believe that at least one item was taken from the apartment and that Dialves more than likely knew his murderer. Francis Dialves was born in Rangoon, Burma. He was a sixth-grade teacher at Echo Valley Elementary School in Prunedale, California for 16 years. He had a bachelor's degree and a master's from Monterey Institute of International Studies. He had also taught in the Burmese department at the Defense Language Institute. If you have any information about the murder of Francis Dialves, please contact the Investigation Division at 831-646-3814.
Thank you for listening to this episode of California True Crime. For full list of our sources as well as more information on the case, head over to our webpage at californiatruecrime.com. You can also support the show by finding a link to our Patreon on this page, which has an option for ad-free episodes, as well as finding a link to our web store where we have California True Crime merchandise for sale. If you'd like to contact us, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Cali True Crime. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. We'd like to thank our quality control engineer, Melanie Duncan. This was recorded at Snail Ranch Studios and is a production of Way Grimace.